And now we're here talking about books on TikTok.
Yay.
And we're here. I don't actually have a copy of the new paperback, but for anyone who is here and doesn't know, we are doing this because the paperback was released today.
Yay.
Yay!
I actually don't have a copy of the paperback either because mine
Yeah.
haven't come yet. But I did see them yesterday when I went to sign books, and they're so tiny. They're like this big.
Oh,
They're so cute.
I know I mean I was really happy when I did see that and also for anyone who's joining who knows me from the UK, this is obviously the American cover, and I love this cover so much, and I'm so glad that the cover remained the same for the
Yeah,
paperback as well, because I don't know who the artist is, but I feel like they just did a perfect job with it.
they absolutely know. The artist is Marlo Loon if you want to follow them. I think they're on Instagram. I think they're also on Twitter, but their stuff is amazing. When they asked me, my publisher asked me who I wanted to do the cover, I was like, yes, them.
That's the one. Well, since we do only, well, technically, I feel like, at least for me, my lives always go for however long, but I know that your time is precious. Eventually, I will have to go to bed. So I do want to try and keep it to an hour. And I have 9 questions that I feel like I have been sitting on for the better part of a year. So when HarperCollins got in touch with me and they were like, do you want to do, I was like, yes. Immediately, yes, because just for myself, just for the selfish reasons of being able to ask you these questions, I am so excited to get into the meat of things. And I am using that term slightly punnyish with this book. I've also tried, for anyone again who is watching now and hoping to tune in, I'm going to try really hard. At least I've tried to phrase the questions in a way that doesn't completely give away a lot of spoilers. Obviously, sometimes we're just going to have to, maybe flag some things. But I think in general, most people should be pretty good with the questions that I'm hoping to dig into. But yeah, if you're good to start, I cannot wait to
Yeah.
pick your brain on these.
Yeah, it's actually funny. My publicist reached out and she's like, "Is there anybody you want to like do a live with to celebrate the launch?" I was like, "Lauren." Lauren is like the number one Juniper understandist on the internet.
I mean, part of me, you know what? I did have like an original order on this, but I feel like that is just such a perfect segue to one question in particular that I just want to start there when it
Yeah.
comes to like oh, I had such a strong emotional reaction, not only to the book, but I wasn't even finished reading the book. And I guess I'll start by kind of like saying that I know that you as an author, you do a really good job of, while you are on social media, you are quite respectful of reader spaces and author spaces. And I know from following you on Instagram as well that you have actually had to be like, hey, please don't tag me in reviews, especially if they're not nice, that kind of a thing. So I know that you do really try to kind of like respect reader spaces, and you don't go tiptoeing in there only when you're yoinked in, without really wanting to be. But nevertheless, as a reader, obviously those things tend to come up for me all the time in reader spaces. And I was tracking my read through Goodreads, and I saw a review posted, and basically for me, the you know when you put something out into the world, especially when it's art, you can have every intention that someone is going to understand X, Y, and Z, but it doesn't matter, right? Like, we know that every reader is going to take something away from it, whether that was your intention or not. But I literally went into mama bear mode because I saw this review of a reader basically policing the way in which our main character handles trauma. and in particular the way in which she handles SA and the I'm always so careful because I don't want, the TikTok overlords to be like, yoink, you're taken off of this because you've said a
Yeah.
particular word, but um of the way she handles intimate relations, let's go with that. In the wake of prolonged essay, especially as she was younger as well. And the reviewer basically was saying, I don't understand why it needed to be so sexual. I don't understand this. Like, she shouldn't have done X, Y, and Z. And I was so mad. I was so mad reading this because while of course I know that reading is subjective, I was sitting back going, you came right up to the point and then you blew right past it. And for me, especially having finished the book eventually, I look back at that review and I go, that reviewer was acting like Papa. Like, or is it Papa or Papa? I don't know how you're supposed to,
That's however you want it to be.
but nevertheless, like Marlinchian's father, in the way in which she is policed and suppressed, and what her sisters partake in as well. So what is it like for you on that side of things? Kind of like, do you ever witness again, I know you don't try to, but when you come around to some of these reviews, do you see the same commonality of these reviewers behaving exactly like the people who are, suppressing and trying to control the main character?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely very ironic. Especially because I think that, like you said, Marlinchen shows like literally the most classic signs in the world of somebody who has suffered CSA, and like literally the number one sign that somebody has suffered from SA as a young child is hypersexuality. So I knew that that would be a controversial element in the book, but I was still kind of surprised, like, to the extent that it was and how hyper focused people were on that aspect of it. Like, people were just mad that she's really horny. I
Yeah.
think, like, that's kind of the reaction. That it's like, well, why does it need to be sexualized? I'm like, well, why does anything need to exist in like any piece of literature ever? But yeah, I do think it's ironic that her sexuality more than anything else has been picked apart by reviewers. And from like a literary perspective, like I've spent so much time up to and like following the publication of this book, kind of defending myself against this term romanticization. Like, does this book romanticize all of the bad things that happen? Which, like, first of all, I think is really funny in like a horror novel, but like the more I think about like just the term is fascinating, and like I've come full circle to the point where I've started to be like, is it a crime to find like beauty and meaning in suffering? Like, isn't that kind of the purpose of art? Like,
Mm.
if you can make something beautiful out of like horror and suffering, isn't that kind of what art is for and what art always has been for? Yeah, so that's the way that I've kind of come to have peace with that kind of feedback, which is pretty relentless. But yeah, I've come around to dealing with it in that way.
For sure. And I know that, you I think you posted something today that was um yeah, just like a really sweet emotional post. I think it was on Instagram, just saying that this book, even though it was a bestseller, you say like it wasn't your most popular book and it wasn't the book that sold the most copies, but it's the book that brought you the most growth as an author. And I guess that this is certainly this unfortunate backlash. Not that it's, I'm just, I call it backlash with quotes because I'm just still at the point of, wow, you're really missing the point. You're missing the point of all of this. But sure, to, everyone is of course allowed to have their own interpretation, but for me, I look at it and I think, wow, we've come a long way as a society, but we still have such a long way to go, especially when it comes to reading these reviews that I know based on names and the ways in which they refer to themselves online. If when you look into who these reviewers are, that these are women and femme presenting people. And even though statistically we're saying like, if any group should understand this the most, it's supposed to be this one, but there's still quite a long way to go, I think, unfortunately. But art like this can shine a light, and maybe as much as there are people who are quite vocal about the ways they don't understand or what they don't like, I'm sure that, and then I wouldn't know because I haven't seen any because it's such a personal thing, but I'm sure for a lot of other people, it was the thing that made them go, oh, now I kind of understand.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that it's definitely been true. And I wouldn't change anything about the book that I wrote. Um, yeah, it's a very special book to me. And I've gotten a lot of not so great feedback, but I've gotten a lot of really, really amazing feedback and the things that people have shared with me. I feel very like grateful that
Mm,
this has been so meaningful for other people too.
yeah.
So yeah, I will keep creating strange,
Yeah.
controversial art.
There's always going to be your people for it, right? And it might not be every single book, but you've got a super fan in me. So I will always be there being like Mama Berry in the comments on like I
Well,
left
I very much
I
appreciate
left that
it.
particular reviewer alone. I was like, I'm not even gonna try. But I did know it was certainly an impetus for me being like, I am going to do a video essay on this, and I'm gonna make sure people understand if they if I can force it. Oh, all right. Less I mean it is the whole book is quite heavy, but I feel like we've opened with one of the heavier questions. So we'll move to something slightly lighter. And that is that with both Juniper and Thorn and The Wolf and the Woodsman, I feel like both books deal with secrets and surprises quite a bit, and they play, a central role in the novels. So while I guess secrets can play a role in any genre, we most closely associate that with thriller. So why do you think it's so compelling to have that play, that be such a central tenet in your novels, which are darker fantasy and in this case, horror?
Yeah, so I actually think that, like, excuse me, the act of hiding certain information from the readers is really crucial for like having horror in a horror novel. Like, for me, the difference between a horror novel and a dark fantasy book is that while a dark fantasy can be really gruesome and like fucked up, it all of this happens within like the rules and like the established understanding of the world. So like in The Wolf and the Woodsman and like chapter what is it, 3, they're attacked by these monsters and like it's very gruesome, but it's not like a shock that these monsters exist. We know from
Mm,
pretty early on that this is a world that has these types of monsters where this type of violence is like kind of quotidian.
yeah.
So it could be like very disturbing and disgusting, but not in the same way. Whereas
No,
I
I mean,
think
like the first sentence is them trying to leash down these trees,
the
right?
trees, yeah, because like trees just walk in this world.
Yeah.
Yeah, so whereas in horror you need to, I think, again, this is just for me personally, I you need to have something that breaks like the characters and therefore the reader's understanding of their own world, something
Mm.
that's like fundamentally incomprehensible to their worldview. And I forget where I read this quote, I wish I could remember, but it's so great. And it's just like fear is being chased by a man with a knife, horror is being chased by a monster made of knives.
Ooh.
And I think to me, that's like the difference between horror and dark fantasy. Horror, you have to have that slow build of something unfolding that like seems so incomprehensible, but in order for that to really pay off, you have to have an understanding of like the rules of the world first.
Gotcha. I love it. Another key theme, which we've already kind of talked about, is suppression and oppression. And especially so in Juniper and Thorn, we get a lot of that, unfortunately. Marlin Shin kind of has that coming in from all sides, including herself and what she is trying to constantly kind of tamp down. So without giving too much away, why tell me why you wanted to pair exploring that theme with a reimagining and sort of retelling of the juniper tree.
Yeah, so I've wanted to specifically write a Juniper Tree retelling for a long time because it's my favorite of the Grimm's fairy tales, like in terms of content, but also like in terms of reception. I think it's really
Mm.
fascinating because out of all of the Grimm's fairy tales, this is the one that has been the most objected to, the most censored, like has evoked the most like pearl clutching, like over the course of literal centuries. Like Tolkien even wrote about this in one of his essays on fairy tales, where he was like big mad that like some versions excluded the part where like they eat the sun, which I think is fascinating, and it just like kind of I was thinking about like why is this story in particular so disturbing? Because there's a lot of really disturbing stories in like Grimm's, but
Mm.
this one really like stood out to people. And I started to think about why. And what I ended up landing on was it's like the intimate nature of this. Like the violence that is displayed on like a very small scale, on a domestic scale.
Mm.
Um, it's a story about how family commits like the grossest abuses and the grossest acts of violence against you. It upsets kind of this universal notion that home is safe, that family is loving. And I think that's fundamentally what's the most disturbing to people. And once I kind of like unlocked that in my brain, then it made it really easy to like turn it into a gothic horror novel, because gothic horror is kind of inherently about, you know, this psychological torment that happens on the domestic scale.
I love that. I never thought of it that way. Sorry, I'm having a moment here where I'm like, I'm supposed to be a host, but I'm also like, no, I need to absorb this. It's
No,
so
you're
good.
good.
Um, okay, let's talk a little bit about Marlinchen's father and how, even though I think there's a lot that she does to fulfill his expectations and his demands, there's there's still quite a like a this act of her preparing the food. There's such a sense of ritual in that food preparation as well as in the eating, but I mean he's just kind of scarfing it all down, but we have so many scenes where she is, you know, preparing pretty much the same meal. And so to me as a reader, that repetition, it felt very hypnotic. My experience, at least, was not one where I'm like, why are we just kind of repeating this for the sake of it? Like, I get it, I get what he eats. Like, there really was a sense of, yeah, of hypnosis with it. So, why was it important for you to build repetition? And is it an act that says more about Marlinchin or about Papa?
Yeah, so Marlenton's world is obviously one that's like heavily structured, heavily ritualized, and I wanted to make sure that came through for the readers and they felt that sense of like almost frustration. Like my editor would leave comments. He was like, "Why are we repeating this? You like you repeat the same things over and over." I'm like, "Yeah, that's the point. It's like supposed to be kind of like annoying almost because that's her life." You
Mm.
know, she wakes up, she tends to her father's every need, which specifically is like feeding him and like, the preparation of food is like described in all of this like very, ritualized detail. And I think that like the horror in that is sort of the juxtaposition between that and how like incredibly out of control he is when he like scarfs down everything immediately. Like she prepares this food so carefully and then he's completely out of control when he eats it. And it's interesting because like this is actually the first interview where I've like really been asked about this specifically, but so Marlynchen also like has bulimia. This is kind of a tricky thing to talk about because oh my god, excuse me. Eating disorders are like very like maligned in real life and like not understood very well. But obviously, central to bulimia is this cycle of restriction, binging, and purging. So the restriction part is when you kind of have the neat little ritual, you have the illusion of control over yourself, the belief that you can actually almost like transcend humanity and, all your bodily needs. And then, you reach a certain threshold where that's unsustainable. And then you binge, and that's when you kind of feel out of control. And then in the aftermath of that, you're disgusted by your need that has been expressed. You're disgusted by like this feeling of like fullness. And I think that Marlynchen is so disgusted by her own appetites because she has been so dehumanized. She doesn't really see herself as a person who's worthy of like satiating her desires in any way. Like bulimia is like it's a very vicious like attack on the body, but it's also like part of a cycle and part of a routine. And so it's another way that like kind of in her coping mechanisms she's painfully mirroring her abuser.
Gotcha. So I guess it says a lot about both of them in that case.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I love it. Makes sense to me. In your writing, you tend to do something that I love, which is you don't just hand it to the reader, whatever it might be. I don't, you're not there holding the reader's hand, making things super, super obvious. Is that a conscious choice that you made as a writer before ever putting pen to paper?
Yeah, so both as like a reader and a writer, I personally just really love when a book like thrusts you into its world in like an immediate and very visceral way. Like I want to be totally immersed in what I'm reading, and that's kind of the way that I write too. And I think that like if you hand things to the reader, you lose a bit of that immersion. The ability to kind of make your audience like feel and think deeply. And so in Juniper and Thorn, this obviously is accomplished by having a really deep point of view with Marlynchen. You only experience the world through her perspective. And this isn't the only way that you can create a really immersive world at all. Like it's not just, deep, limited, first person POV. Like I would contrast like Pure Nessie by Susanna Clarke, which does the same like really deep point of view, and you're just thrust into this very bizarre world, and you only see it through Pure Nessie's eyes. And then you can contrast that with like Gormenghast, which has this omniscient like third person perspective, but is also like incredibly immersive because it holds back information from the reader and it doesn't fully explain things. It just kind of like the world and the house just kind of unfold throughout the book. But yeah, I think like you want to be judicious with the way that you kind of dole out information. And I'm just always someone who like, positive or negative, I just want to like feel very deeply when I read. Like again, even if it's like upsetting, I just like it's catharsis. I'm like, just make me sad. Like I don't care.
No, yeah. I'm with you, and I mean, no kidding. I love your work so much because I'm like, just break me, like shatter my soul, like just pull me apart as a human. Because I feel like I think I've actually heard some reviewers say this as well, that sometimes it's easier to write reviews for books when they're either, on one or the other extreme, whether they absolutely love it or absolutely hate it, because at the end of the day, then they're at least feeling something. And it's the ones in the middle where you're just kind of like, eh, that become really difficult to talk about. And so it actually makes a lot of sense to me in that regard, that, whatever the emotion might be, just make me feel something. Hopefully
Yeah.
you don't want to, of course we don't want to be reading things that we absolutely despise, but like I want to feel absolutely everything. I want the whole gamut of the human experience in what I read. So I'm assuming that these are the types of books that you are picking up and, falling in love with as well.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I think like it's I definitely like I understand I'm always gonna write books that people either love or hate. And like I'm totally fine with that. Like, especially writing horror, like I'm completely fine with people like hating my book and like thinking it's disgusting. Like I have no problem with that. The only thing that is like difficult for me is when people have to politicize that emotion and go to the place
Mm,
where it's like, this made me feel bad, so this is bad. This is a bad thing that shouldn't exist in the world. And I think that that's like it's difficult for like me to deal with as an individual, but it's also
mm,
like it makes me feel kind of bad that people feel this need to like politicize their emotions immediately like in this culture. It's like really mentally unhealthy because you should feel safe feeling your feelings without having to externalize them. Like your feelings are safe, the feelings don't hurt anybody. Like it's you need to be able to express your feelings safely in a way that isn't like immediately externalizing them and turning them into kind of like weapons. And it's kind of, I don't know. That's one of the things that I, not to go on like a spiel, but that's one of the things that I
no,
think
I
is
mean,
kind of
I
really
think,
important and really valuable about art is that it allows us to safely feel a full spectrum of emotions and, experiences.
I think it actually kind of ties into the psychology we were just talking about with Merlinchen, in the sense that you've got these readers who don't feel safe or are so out of their depth with what they are experiencing emotionally, and therefore they're in their own, like, to them it feels like out of control. And so their initial response is, I'm now going to control everyone on this, because not only should I not be feeling this, is it bad for me to be feeling this, but I'm going to go to such an extreme as to say this whole work is bad, because no one should be writing about this, because no one should be experiencing this, which to me is just wild cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes me really like upset for like art in general that like
Mm,
this is the way some people are experiencing it because like I said, I think the beauty of art is the catharsis. So yeah, I don't know. I hopefully we can continue to make progress towards this idea that, art that makes you feel bad isn't bad. It's not bad art. It's not morally wrong. It's
mm.
just it's art. It's life. It's I don't know.
Especially in the sense that it is like it isn't life. Like, we are, in this case, we are talking about fiction. So while whatever people are experiencing emotionally is real life, I think of all the things to be really wound up over, policing the art itself is probably not the answer. Yeah, I'm a huge proponent in that, and I think we can go down a huge rabbit hole, especially with, even as a Canadian living in the United Kingdom. I mean, I know what's happening in the US right now, and so I feel like that's a separate conversation, but I think it's nevertheless timely and ties into all of that for sure.
Yeah.
So, talking a little bit about societal expectations, and societal norms, and the things that our society in general kind of like lauds, like physical beauty. To me, I've always kind of seen that any of these norms and expectations, when given to the right writer and in the right writer's hands, it's really just an opening to flout those norms and those expectations. So, with that said, why is it? Because again, I'm looking at, yes, Juniper and Thorn, but also The Wolf and the Woodsman. Why is it, and again, I might be making an assumption here, but why is it important to you to write characters who aren't classic beauties?
Yeah, I've been like fascinated by the way people have responded to Marlinchian's like physical appearance in particular. At least the way it's described in the book. Like the other characters call her ugly or plain faced, but we don't get anything more specific than that, really. She describes herself in one scene and she kind of says she has like sallow skin and like circles under her eyes, and she has brown hair, dark eyes, a long nose. These are like, this is the most like kind of objective description that we get of her. And for this book in particular, I wanted to write her as having these more pedestrian features, you know, in comparison to her sisters who have this like impossible fairy tale type of beauty, you know, golden hair, violet eyes, which like, you know. And I also like specifically gave Marlinchian a lot of the stereotypical features of like Eastern Slavs, which I'm saying this is an Eastern European. And I think people have their preconceived notions about those features, and I think that's important to understanding the context of the world and how Marlinchian fits into it. Yeah, and I've had a lot of people interestingly say, "Oh, Marlinchian isn't like ugly. People are just like saying that to like be mean or whatever." And I'm like, again, like I can't control what people think about that, and I think the different interpretations of that are really interesting. And it's true to an extent. People are just being cruel to her, and you know her perception of herself is not reliable. But whatever she looks like, kind of objectively, if that can ever be, you know, an objective thing, you know, the way she moves through the world is not as a woman who's conventionally attractive. And I think that that is very clear. And I think in the writing of the book makes that very clear. And maybe it's not, I don't know. But you know, I think like weirdly people just won't accept that like maybe she actually just is not pretty, like, and not in like, you know, the Mary Sue way of like, oh, I'm so ugly with my shining mahogany hair and my luminous green orbs or like whatever.
Yeah.
Like, and I think because this is so rooted in like fairy tales and fairy tale logic, it was really important for me to reject the like notion that beauty is goodness, which is like in every fairy tale ever. So,
Yes.
you know, I wanted to very specifically kind of reject that and kind of explore beauty in that way. And you see, you know, beauty explored in a very different way with Save Us.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, these are things that we know in real life. Like if we're talking about whether we're seeing other people just refuse to believe that they're reading a book about a character who is not, you know, some insane type of beauty, or could very like well likely, if we are to at least believe Marlinchian. I know that obviously the way in which she sees herself is probably slightly more than slightly warped to reality because of everything she's been through, and what she absorbs, of the cruelness that she absorbs of those around her. But nevertheless, she really could be not a pretty character. And yet we are so used to being just kind of hand fed these characters that meet this expectation, that we can't even believe it when the author and the other characters and the character themselves are saying, no, she's very plain faced. You know, like, what, I don't know. I think that says a lot more about us, but I do love that that was certainly a conscious choice on your part to say, yeah, I'm not going to buy into that.
Yeah, like she is, the uncontested heroine of this book, this book that's so steeped in fairy tale logic, but she's also
Mm.
not, the beautiful one among her sisters. And that's like, I don't know, it's just for me, it's important to just kind of reject that.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that for sure. Random question, but remind me, and not to be creepy, it does have to do with the question, but
No,
did I read in your bio somewhere at some point in time, in stalking all of your work, that you live in Palo Alto?
yes, I
You
do.
do. Okay. So then this does relate to the question. People are not like, why are you stalking the author, Lauren? But so Juniper and Thorn takes place in this fictional city of Oblia, and it's described as being on the cusp of change, of kind of moving from magic to industry, is I think the phrase that's used. So given that, is that's the book, but then also kind of like the context with which is it was written, you are kind of in the home of tech and of big tech, which at least to me is in many ways a sort of real life fairy tale, right? Like, I mean, aside from what I do with the bookish stuff, like I work in tech, and even just my proximity to SF, I have experienced things that are just bonkers. Like you just don't think it's going to be real life, and it's nevertheless stuff that I have experienced firsthand. So has that played into any of your writing? The fact that you're in this kind of real life fairy tale of sorts? And have you drawn inspiration from that?
Yeah, I love this question. Like, Palo Alto is honestly like a fascinating place to live for so many reasons. And especially coming from, so I grew up in New York, which is obviously the epitome of old money. And then moving here, I lived in New York my whole life until I moved here. Whereas Palo Alto, like you said, is the epicenter of, like, in some ways, like new wealth, a lot of which is like created by immigrant diversity. And when I first moved here, I actually worked at a tech startup that did AI robotics, which was an experience unlike anything I'd experienced in the past. Like, literally, my job before that was working in a senator's office where we literally still use fax machines. So that was a big change. I don't know if I was like consciously aware of it at the time, but it definitely felt like a huge culture shock to me,
Mm.
moving here. And there's both New York and Palo Alto are like deeply dystopian places
Yeah.
in many ways. But I think like the way that people conceive of wealth and cultural capital and,
Mm.
all of these things is so different here than in New York. Another thing is like living outside of New York for the first time, like totally changed my understanding of like my Jewish identity as well. Because as most people know, New York is like one of the most Jewish cities in the world. Um, yeah, so all that to say, yes, I think like on a subconscious level that probably did influence a lot of what I wrote about in this book, just going from like the epitome of like the old money America to, big tech and, new money and, just new ways and lifestyles. And one of my coworkers literally drank Soylent for dinner every night when he told me that. Like, I don't cook, but like when he told me that, it like upset me so deeply.
Oh, and let me guess, the way in which this coworker told you it was a brag. It was, I'm better than you because I'm saving time, I'm being more efficient, and I'm life hacking my way.
Life hacking, yeah.
Was that the vibe? Am I getting that right?
He was a really nice guy to be fair. But yeah, it was just very strange. Even the working culture was so different. Like people here, like companies here, because they want to retain their workers so much, like because workers don't really have like any particular loyalty to a particular company, and there's so many startups that start up and then go under. Every company is obsessed with creating like the most like positive working environment, and I think this got started at places like Google, where it's like, hey, we have a room for like napping and a room for like playing with Legos, and like everyone just wears like jeans and sweatpants. And like, again, coming from New York and working in, New York working culture, it was so strange to come here and see that. Like, for the first couple of weeks, I was so dressed up compared to all my coworkers. And it was like, yeah, it was very weird. My coworkers also kept asking me if I was going to write a book about robots because
Really?
obviously, yeah, they're making robots. Yeah, like robots like scare me a lot, but like not in a way I want to explore through literature.
I love that. You're like terrified of them, but I don't even want to touch them. I'm
Yeah,
gonna
I'm
stick
like,
with my gory horror
yeah,
and
I'm like it's too much. Although I do love like a good sci-fi horror.
true. But it's at least there's no plans in the imminent future for a SF dystopic AI running the world.
Yeah, not that, but actually my next YA is a dystopian book. Just not robot dystopia, but yeah.
Gotcha. Understood.
Yeah. No robots here.
You're like, well, maybe come back to it.
We'll,
Maybe.
we'll we'll circle back, yeah.
I love it. Okay, let's talk about Sebas a little bit because there was, oh, okay. I mean, I won't go off on my soapbox about how much I love the book because I think everyone already knows. I wouldn't be here if I didn't love the book. But certainly a huge part about it is just how much I adored not only Marlin Shin, but in many ways her twin flame in Sevas. And while I would ask you a billion questions, I am going to narrow it down to just asking about him being a principal ballet dancer. So, when you were first putting together your ideas for the book, why did you land on making him a dancer?
Yeah, so Sevas is actually inspired by two specific people, two ballet dancers. The first is Vaslav Nijinsky, who was a Polish ballet dancer at the start of the 20th century. He was, the most important male ballet dancer of the century, essentially. He was known in particular for having this ethereal grace and this beauty, absolute, just like twink legend. But he was also known for having this really like complex relationship with his handler, Sergei Diaghilev. And his life was incredibly tragic in a lot of ways. And when I read his diaries, which were just recently published in English in like their full unredacted form, if anyone wants to read them, I was just kind of captivated by that. And one of the interesting things about him as well is that, because of the time period, we don't have any recordings of him dancing. So all we have are, people's descriptions of like watching him dance. And so through that, we really focus more on how he made people feel with his dancing, like the emotions that his dancing evoked in people. And that was like really magical and beautiful. And he's also inspired by another dancer who people might know, Sergei Polanin, who's a Ukrainian ballet dancer. He's the guy who did the like famous "Take Me to Church" like ballet dance, like the tattooed guy.
The bad boy of ballet.
Yeah, we don't talk about what he's been doing recently, but I watched a documentary about him, and he was the youngest principal dancer at the Royal Ballet Theatre in London until he kind of had this like pretty public meltdown, kind of went off the rails in a big way. Again, we're not going to talk about like the Putin tattoo or anything, but both of these specific people inspired his character a lot. And landing on ballet as like a part of the book was it felt pretty natural to me because it's a very important part of Russian culture, especially during the time period, and like Russian national identity, particularly in the early 20th century. And as like a sport and an art form, ballet, it requires this like very like ascetic devotion while simultaneously having to seem like it's graceful and effortless. So you disguise kind of like the pain and all of the pain and the effort behind it. You kind of have to like transcend your basic humanity to be a
Absolutely.
dancer, like, you know, going beyond the limits of the human body, or at least seeming that way.
Mm,
And I think the contrast between those two things really exemplifies the themes of the book and his characters. You know, he's like kind of literally the cog in like the machine of the performance. It kind of grinds on mercilessly night after night. And as a dancer, as a very young dancer, he's very much like sexualized against his will. And his physical appearance and his youthfulness are kind of like inordinately valued to the point where he feels like he doesn't have any humanity underneath that, you know. He talks a lot about how by the time he's 30, like he's just done, like nobody's going to care about him anymore. And I think that that just creates a very interesting mirror between him and Marlon Chen. Yeah, and that's the reason why he doesn't, you know, put any weight to her physical appearance. Like that's not something that matters to him because he's seen how like shallow that is.
yeah. And how I guess he's objectified in a way that leaves him with zero agency in his life, and also sees him or has him see none of the financial profits,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah, and that's definitely a very big thing too, and that continues to be a big thing for dancers today. But especially for Sevas, who is like a Jewish character from like the Jewish ghettos, and it's very much part of like the level of control that Derkach and the ballet have over him is this like constant threat that like we could send you back to, you know, this horrible poverty. So yeah, it's he's going through it.
He definitely is. But I don't know. It's I love it so much, and I love that the decision was made that that was going to be his vocation, I guess let's call it. Both on a personal note, because I grew up doing ballet. I was not really any that good at all, so I can't say that it's like I like tortured myself and like my toes are all misshapen. Like I was never good enough to get to like that part, but nevertheless, you know, there's it's always going to own a little piece of my heart. And out of the hundreds and hundreds of books that I've read, I can't think of another book where the you know, one of the main characters and the love interest is artistic in that sense. Which yeah, I don't know. I thought it was perfect for the story as well. Okay, last question, which is good because we've got, you know, a little bit more time left. Going to be really, really selfish for this one. So for anyone who hasn't read the novels yet, I'm not sure. Okay, I'm gonna ask the question in like a vague sense, and if you think that you can answer it without spoilers, we'll do that. But if it is way more interesting to answer with spoilers, then we'll just tell everyone to leave if you haven't read the book yet. Okay, so we've got this storyline that to me, as I was reading it, I was like, this is so brilliant because it's literally just like a Russian nesting doll of the same storyline. So we've got the one which is, I'm going to try and be really vague here. So there's like the family's book of tales. And so there's that storyline. Then there's the storyline with Sevas and the ballet that he is performing every single night. And then there's the third kind of rendition of this storyline, which plays out in real time. So I know that for even someone who has read the book might be like, Lauren, what the heck are you talking about? Do you think we should just kind of get into it, or
Yeah, yeah. I think that's yeah. for
Okay,
sure.
all right. So I think you know what I'm trying to say anyways. So I'll let you just kind of answer it and clarify for people if people are like, can you please make sense of what the hell Lauren just asked? But my question here is, if there was a chicken and egg, what was, what came first in this scenario? Like, what was your starting point for this storyline, which has echoes in various aspects of the novel?
Yeah, well, I think this comes down to just like the way that I write. So for me, like theme always comes before anything else when I'm writing a book. So like the why before the what, if that makes sense. Like
Mhm.
why this story? Why is it important to me? Why is it meaningful? What significance does it hold? And so like once I kind of unlock the core themes of the book, the rest of the story, like the plot, the characters, all the motifs, the symbols, kind of just, I don't know, it's like the meme of like the guy with like the brain with like a bunch of different beams of light coming out. Like that's how it feels to me. Um, and I think like that's because I don't really do these like detailed outlines. And I think that starting from a place where I know the why and I understand like the purpose of the story, like to me, that helps me make every single little decision down to like line by line, like what metaphor to use. Because I'm always referring back to that, like that central idea, that why. So I think that's how, this is kind of vague too, but like that's how kind of like these three different stories are all knitted together in a sense.
Do
Like
you
you
want
said,
to
they're
just kind
all
of do you want to just explain to everyone what we're talking about?
yeah. So basically, there's the main story, like the plot that's happening, and then there's the ballet that Save Us performs in every night, and then there's these stories from her family's book of stories, and all of these kind of mirror each other in a sense. And all of this mirrors kind of the original fairy tale, the juniper tree. Yeah, I think I actually like in preparation for this, I actually went back to my original like Scrivener document where I drafted the first draft of this book, and I like looked through to see like what was I thinking? Like what did I actually write first? And I actually wrote the first thing that I wrote was actually the story of Ivan and the Swan, which is in chapter 6, I believe, which is like the story from her family's book of stories. Um, yeah, so that actually like weirdly came first to me. Like I kind of had the idea of like Marlon shouldn't say this, but I wrote that because I was kind of that helped me kind of figure out the elements of the juniper tree that I was integrating into the book, like transformation, consumption, the grossness of romance, like
Wait, hold on a second. You can't just drop a bomb like the grossness of romance and not expect me to be like, go on.
I feel like all of my books are kind of just like, oh, love is like gross and amazing. Yeah, I don't like the whole, well, okay, I'll say like my favorite part of like the Juniper Tree fairy tale is the fact that after all of this like carnage, the
Mm.
last line is that the family goes inside and eats lunch. And like I've always found that like so like I love that. That's just kind of iconic. Like after eating like your son, they're just like, I don't know, I'm feeling a little hungry. Let's go have lunch. Um yeah, so I feel like that energy is something that I wanted to capture how like being so I don't know, like showing being so vulnerable in like love is kind of like it's like kind of this bodily thing that's like kind of gross because you're like in people's like insides in a very deep way and you know someone so like intimately that it's like I don't know, it's just it's weird, it's gross kind of like I don't know, my
I,
partner better not watch this, but
I think, okay, wait. This might be like a weird parallel and I might be totally off base here, but when people, if you say you pick literally any word and then you say the word again and again and again and again and again. And the more you do it, the stranger it almost becomes. Is that kind of what you're getting at when
Yeah,
we're talking
definitely.
about like am I on the right track here?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's so funny. Like you even see this like come up in very quotidian ways. Like people will explain like how in love they are with their partner by saying like I can do all these gross things in front of them and like they still love me. Like even if like I can pee with the door open and like my partner still loves me because we've been together for 10 years. Like so I don't know, I think it's so interesting. Like we kind of just accept that knowing other people is kind of gross because we know this other but we also know our own need and we acknowledge this like very visceral, you know, deep-seated human need to be loved. And it's like what there's that Anne
Mm.
Carson quote about how like loving anything is like being deranged. Um but yeah, that's like that's the energy that I would like to bring to all of my works.
I love it. So, what can we expect moving forward as you're talking about said energy?
Yeah, so my next book is out in September. It's my YA debut. It's called The Study in Drowning. It's a dark academia romantasy, academic rivals to lovers. I'm still working on my like two sentence pitch for this one. But yeah, I'm really excited about it. This is definitely, I mean, it's YA, so it doesn't have the same level of horror and, you know, explicitness, but I think it is like the book I've read that I would call like a romance in a true sense. It's definitely like the romance features is like the most core aspect of the book. And then in 2024, I have my next adult book, which is Lady Macbeth, which
Yep.
is a reimagining of obviously the character from Macbeth. It's again, I'm working on my pitch for this one because it's a very, very strange book. In some ways, the strangest book I've written. So, yeah, I just got my edit notes for it today, actually. But yeah, it's we pitched it as Cersei meets Wolf Hall, but it's probably not. I feel like I'm gonna have to say this a million times. Like when arcs go out, I'm like, whatever you expect, it's probably not that. So just like go into it with zero expectations. But yeah, I had a lot of fun with that one. I'm really excited for that one. And then going forward, I have another YA book in 2025. And yeah, that's what's coming down the pipe from me.
Well, I don't know if you saw some of the comments that popped up the minute you started talking about a study in drowning. There, we've got two ARC readers. So sorry, I think most people here probably know, but just in case, you know, advanced copies have already gone out, at least digital copies in the US. And you had two people basically screaming in all caps, being like, "I loved it." My copy should be arriving imminently.
It's so
Don't have
pretty.
it
The
yet.
UK like design coffee. Oh, it's so beautiful.
Very, very excited. Well, we are at 9 o'clock. I have obviously taken up an entire hour of your time.
No,
I haven't seen any comments kind of come in being like people like desperately asking anything. I feel like just in case anyone has been like waiting for their moment to like pop up with a question, we'll give everyone like because there is a little bit of a lag sometimes. So we'll give everyone like a second if there is something that they wanted to say. But is there anything that I have not asked that you are disappointed that I have not, or some thoughts that you wanted to leave everyone with?
Um, from me, I don't know. I think this is amazing. We really covered everything. Thank you so much for this. I was so excited for this that we
Me too.
finally get to talk. Your like content about Juniper has been like some of my favorite stuff that I've ever read about any of my books. So yeah,
Well, I
thank you.
I really was a mad woman. I always kind of refer to my like 3 a.m. scribbles. You know what I should do? I don't know if, hold on. We're gonna, let me find it because it's gonna be. So I've got my ARC copy. Like I quite literally was writing it, like. So I've got in the back. I don't know if you can see it, but
Oh my
I'm like
God.
themes. And like emancipation, poison, food, also related, cannibalism. Like
So,
I was an absolute nutcase. And this scribble, this was after I was like going through it and writing, like, let's see if I've got anything that I can find really easily, like in the margins of me. Okay, like, I don't know, like, what am I saying here? Apparently, this says that it's an interesting way to talk about abuse and me trying to figure out what. Anyways, the point being, Uh, what am food plus eating equals possession. This book makes
yes.
this I haven't read these in so long. This literally says over here, this book makes me feel like a student again. It's magnificent.
It's like a dream, truly like a dream to hear as an author. Like, that just makes me so happy.
Well, maybe one day I will find a way to get this copy to you so you could actually
Oh.
see the madness that was me trying to like. Oh, I had so much fun reading this.
That would make me so happy. God.
Thank you so, so much. I'm just gonna do a quick little scan through the comments. I
Yeah.
think oh, okay, we've got one from Madison that we haven't covered, and then we'll let everyone go after that. So Madison has asked, are there any books that you've read that have helped you as an author?
Um, so not like craft books necessarily, but like I feel like I might have talked about this book before, but I wrote in high school and then I was kind of going through like a period in my life where like it was just a difficult like mental period for me and I'd kind of stopped reading, stopped writing. And I was feeling just really kind of down about myself as a creative person. And then I went to like this used bookstore just to kind of look around. This was when I was at Columbia, and I found this book just by the title, and I just bought it because the title was such a banger. It was St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves, and I'm like, well, obviously I'm gonna buy this. And it's a short story collection by Karen Russell, and I can't even explain how much that book just like reignited my love for reading
Mm.
and for writing. And it was like the content was part of it, but also just like the style. I was like, wow, like prose like can just be so much fun to read. Like every single sentence can just have so much in it that it's like so beautiful and it's so like engaging. And Karen is kind of the queen of like just incredibly weird like stories and concepts. Like in her latest book, one of my favorite stories is about a guy who's like a tornado breeder, like a cattle breeder, but he breeds like storm like tornadoes. But it's
As you
just like
do.
amazing metaphor for like parenthood. But yeah, so that book, and I still feel like those stories and just her work in general is something that I like always refer back to when I'm thinking about like style in particular and like
Mm.
developing my prose style and like wanting to be really evocative with my prose. So I would definitely recommend checking out her short stories. They're amazing.
That's perfect. Thank you so much for doing this with me and allowing me to ask my my all over the map, but nevertheless, they truly were my burning questions. This has been so much fun, and yeah, I guess just as I guess as a closer, the reason we were able to do this, not that I mean we could do this, I guess whenever we wanted, but the impetus for doing this is because Juniper and Thorn is now out in paperback in the US. So happy birthday to the paperback. And yeah, so if you haven't read Juniper and Thorn, I'm not a sellout. I one am getting paid nothing to do this. So let's just be clear that I There's no money being changed hands. I'm not being paid to do this. Two, I really did say in, I think it was the Washington Post that asked me, they're like, what's the best book that you read in 2022? And I was like, well, Juniper and Thorn. So it has my vote. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, you definitely, definitely should. And if you have read it, well, then you know why it's so special. So, Ava, thank you so much for being able to, yeah, for just being a sport, for answering all my weird
No,
questions
this
and
was
joining me
so
for this.
amazing. I love getting to talk about this book with you. It was honestly like
Yay!
such a dream. So, yeah, I hope
Yay!
everyone has a good day. Have a good night. Go to
Yeah,
sleep.
yeah, wherever you are, if you're in my time zone, maybe it's time for bed. But if, you're in California like you, I feel like it's what, like 3 o'clock now?
Yes. So
Yeah.
I'll be answering emails until the end of time. But yeah.
Well, thank you everyone as well who has been here for this whole live. Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we get to do this again soon.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
All right, have a good night, everyone. See
Bye.
ya.